What I want to talk about really is how the battle that you're going through in this country with this whole narrative about productivity, efficiency, the market, competition, deregulation, is actually not new. This has been going on in many countries for years, and it's based on all sorts of myths that really need to be debunked. And we should, I sort of see my role in terms of helping both politicians, civil society, business leaders, the ones that are willing to listen, to really rethink that whole narrative. And I want to start off just with, again, making you feel not too alone, just with the reflection that this battle, which is a battle about actually achieving not just any growth, right? You currently have growth just based on oil, but you want, say, investment-driven growth. You want smart, innovation-driven growth. In the UK, by the way, we currently have growth. It's purely consumer debt-driven. We've made it really easy for people whose incomes have not been rising to buy homes, right? So very high debt-to-income levels, again, and this is causing short-term growth. That's not what we want. So we want smart, innovation-led growth. We want inclusive growth, right? So growth that actually is distributed in a better way, so it causes less, not more, inequality, if you think of Piketty's big message. We want sustainable growth, both in the green sense, but also over time, right? We don't just want a one-shot deal. And in some countries, especially the Anglo-Saxon countries, where we've had so much financialization, where the financial sector has completely outdriven the real economy industry, as well as the real economy becoming financialized, we want to rebalance, if you want, away from speculative, financial-driven growth towards, if you want, a different type of growth. Now, what I want to really argue is that the biggest battle, however, the biggest battle is how to think about these things in a way that actually allows us to think of public policy in a big way, in a way that is really transformational and is not just tinkering on the sidelines. And John Maynard Keynes, who was a very important economist, you might have heard about him, has this wonderful quote, God, I better look here, where he says that, all these people who are sort of on the ground, policymakers, local, regional, and national, who somehow think they're just getting their hands dirty and they don't care about theory, they don't care about what the economists say, they're actually slaves of defunct economic theory. The power of economic thought is extremely strong, especially in terms of providing a very, very narrow way of thinking about the public sector. And I don't have too much time to go into this, but just to sort of give you some background, basically, economists, and hence politicians, and hence journalists, really think about the role of government sort of in three ways. The first is, of course, the Tea Party way, which is, government is bad, blah, 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 which I'm going to ignore for now, okay? I'm just going to pretend that we're all adults in this room, okay? But even, no, but I have a bad message, which is even with adults in this room, or, when I speak to people who are mature, there's a problem, which is, again, we have a very limited way of thinking about it. Either we talk about, and I think this is how currently your government is talking about it, we need government, yes, of course, we don't do the Tea Party thing, we are more mature. However, what's government for? It's just for creating the conditions, right? Some sort of general background conditions which create competitiveness, and then the really interesting stuff is going to be within business. So government's kind of a bit boring and a kind of a bit inertial, not very dynamic, quite static, so we need to limit it. So it should create these horizontal conditions, level the playing field, and then get the hell out of the way, okay? Or economists who like to do all these nice fancy economic models also talk about this concept, which is that we need government to fix market failures. So sometimes the market screws up. And we know that, right? We just went through a massive screw-up with the financial crisis, but also just more generally, on a continual basis, the market screws up. How? Well, there's a concept, for example, of public goods. Some goods, like, for example, basic research, right? Say nuclear fusion or, that kind of blue sky research, it's very hard to appropriate the returns to it if you're a company. If you invest in it, it's very hard to say, okay, that's just mine, because there's such high spillovers. Right? And so it's commonly understood, everyone, all these nice adults who talk about the state agree that when you have a public good with high spillovers, for example, basic research, the government should come in and fund it. Same thing perhaps with infrastructure. Same thing when you have sort of positive or negative externalities, which means, for example, if you have pollution and firms are not incorporating the cost of pollution into their costs, then they will create too much pollution, and so government has to step in and fix that market by, for example, creating something like a carbon tax, right? So tax the polluters. Now, the point is that all these things are true. Yes, you need government to set the conditions. Yes, you need government also to come in every now and then and fix little market failures. But actually, what has gone on in the few countries in the world, for example, that have achieved innovation-driven growth and done some really big things, think of Silicon Valley in California, you actually had government much, much, much more active than just these two sort of tinkering on the sidelines. And apologies for this slide, it's very self-promotional, but this is why they invited me. So I wrote this book called The Entrepreneurial State, arguing this, that these myths about entrepreneurship, about competitiveness, productivity, efficiency, innovation, dynamism, creativity in places like Silicon Valley are a complete lie. It's not that Steve Jobs wasn't important. Of course he was. It's not that Bill Gates is not important. Of course he's important, and so is Elon Musk today with Tesla. The point is that what these people have been able to do in a very, very intelligent way is surf a massive wave of government-funded investments, which I want to talk to you about now with some examples so you can actually believe me. And what I'm trying really to do, and I'll sort of keep coming back to this, is really debunk this myth, right? Which is what I just said. You have the government, yes, it's needed, but it's a bit boring, right? It's lethargic, it's a dinosaur, it's the bureaucrat. That's a picture of Kafka up there. And then you have the Silicon Valley really cool types, right? And so all that government needs to do is feed, if you want, fuel this wonderful dynamism in the private sector. And so what I've done in my work, and I continue to do looking around the world, is actually ask, well, what actually allowed us in modern capitalism to, I need to keep checking the time here so I don't go over, to actually come up with these amazing general purpose technologies, which mean not just going from an iPhone 5 to an iPhone 6, but the really important big technological changes, including, say, the internet, which really created decades of growth in many countries and many different sectors, but also, space, nuclear power, nanotechnology, or today the emergence, if you want, of the clean tech sector. What has actually led to these revolutionary changes? And the answer is, and again, I'll go through some of these examples with you, a very active public sector, decentralized. This is not about Big Brother, the ministry, looking down on society. This was a decentralized network of different types of public sector agencies, which were able to really interact in that upper right-hand quadrant, where you have very high technological and market risk, high capital intensity, and don't get scared about this graph here, I'll quickly explain it, actually operating across the entire innovation chain. So remember before I said that a typical public good would be basic research, right, which is really upstream, kind of blue sky stuff. So yes, it's true. These orange abbreviations here are examples in the US of public agencies that did invest in public research. So the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, DARPA, that actually came up with the internet. I tell that story in the book. But actually, these investments have been all across the chain. So already there we see there's a problem. The public good story only tells us about the big science, but what happened there? And also, these investments were not about just fixing market failures. They were actively trying to create and shape new markets that didn't exist. I call them mission-oriented investments because this is not just about, say, industrial policy feeding one sector, aerospace, automobiles. It's things like, let's go to the moon, right? So the whole man on the moon mission actually required many different sectors, including textiles, to be innovative. And so really one of the big questions that I'll also ask you in the end are, what are the missions that we could be thinking about today? I mean, there's some obvious ones around climate change, around the aging crisis, But again, if we look at places that have actually achieved this smart innovation-led growth, they have had very active, strategic, mission-oriented, market-making, not just market-fixing public policies. This is a graph that's very interesting because it's showing you, in the US, the amount of public venture capital. Venture capital is the sort of high-risk finance, which in theory, people think is what led to, say, the whole biotechnology revolution, right? These cool financiers, not the boring banks, but the venture capitalists who were able to give money to companies like Apple, Facebook, Amazon. And the truth is actually wrong. It was actually public venture capital funds which have been able to, or still today, which are willing to really take on the early stage high risk. Most venture capital tends to come in sort of mid-stage. But the very early stage, even recently with Tesla Motors, Tesla got $465 million from the Obama administration as a guaranteed loan. This program here is called the Small Business Innovation Research Program, SBIR, and this graph just shows you the difference between how much this program, government-funded, has been willing to provide early-stage companies with that needed finance to be innovated versus the venture capital sector, which, by the way, is really interested in an exit. They want to exit as soon as possible, usually 3 to 5 years, usually through an IPO in the stock market, and that's not what that innovation cycle I showed you before needs. That can take 20 years, right? So this need for long-term, patient, committed finance is really the way that today we should be thinking about finance when we talk about financial reform. Instead, unfortunately, many countries just say, oh, we want to be innovative, we need more venture capital, without recognizing that actually the venture capitalists themselves have really followed massive amounts of public money. I often give the example of the iPhone because the iPhone is such a symbol of innovation all over the world. And the reason this is a smartphone and not a stupid, idiotic phone is what you can do with it, right? So you can surf the internet, you can know where you are with GPS, you can use touchscreen display, you can talk into it with a Siri. All those technologies, internet, GPS, touchscreen, and Siri, were funded by the US government. It's a bit scary, by the way, when you start looking at the names up there. It's like the Navy, the Army, the CIA, right? So all my left-wing friends are like, shit, what does this mean? We need a military-industrial complex to come up with the iPhone? And the answer is, well, yeah, sort of. But the better part of the answer is, you know what? What's really interesting, actually, is that that lesson of how important it was to actually have this massive amount of public funds directly funding this interesting stuff has actually been applied to health and energy, which is not the military-industrial complex. This is the figures for the US government, and the reason I'm focusing, by the way, so much on the US is simply to mythologize, to break that myth about the competitive US versus, the big welfare state in Europe. With innovation and competitiveness, the US has achieved this through big, big active government that no one talks about. So forgive me for constantly giving you these US examples, but we need to debunk the myth in order to go forwards. So this funding here is just amazing. So even after the crisis, this funding agency called National Institutes of Health spent $32 billion just in 2012. Sorry, 31, almost 31 billion. That's a lot of money. And in fact, there's all sorts of studies, for example, by this wonderful doctor called Marcia Angels, who actually was the editor of a very important journal called the New England Journal of Medicine, who shows that it was this funding, and continues to be this funding, that actually is responsible for the really important medicines that come out. These are the new molecular entities with priority rating, the important medicines, not Viagra with a different color, different dosage, so what we call Me Too drugs. And so, this, again, story is not told. Why? Because the pharmaceutical companies like to talk about themselves as the great innovators, right? That's in fact how they justify these extremely high prices that they charge all over the world. You just happen to have a very good welfare state that subsidizes that for you, but it's your tax money, if you want, that's paying for those very high prices. And without recognizing that actually what they've been doing is, again, surfing on lots of taxpayer-funded money, and often the taxpayer pays twice, right? Both for the research and then for these very high drugs. If you compare countries across the world, what's interesting is, all this money that I've been talking about, say directly funding the internet, directly funding medicines, is, again, direct. It's not indirect. What do I mean by indirect? Indirect would be funding just through tax incentives, right? This is the way that lots of governments, they say, we need to be competitive, we need to take away tax, we need to take away regulation. That's how we're going to be productive. Ignoring these numbers here, which show you again that, for example, in the US, almost all the funding has been direct. They've hardly used tax credits. That, of course, does get used, but it tends to be sort of icing on the cake. Why? Because what actually drives business investment, which is what we want them to do, right? We want businesses to invest, not to hoard, to hide away the cash, or not just to spend it on things like share buybacks, which I'll get to later. What drives business investment, and this is also very important in Keynes, is that perception of where the future opportunities are. Then they'll invest. You can reduce their taxes, you can reduce interest rates. No one will invest if they don't see an opportunity. And lots of these stories that I tell in the book, and also some of the examples I've given you now, are examples of opportunity creation. So that's really how policymakers should be thinking. Of course, in Europe, we're completely messed up right now because we don't get any of this, and we pretend that the uncompetitive parts of Europe, the famous pigs, right, the porky pigs, I'm allowed to say because I'm Italian, so Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain. This is a terrible word that Goldman Sachs came up with. Again, if I was German, I would not say the word, but as an Italian, I can say they call us the pigs. These countries actually are not the ones that have been spending the most. Italy, for example, has had a low deficit for years, 3%, that's nothing. For 20 years, they've had a 3% deficit, even lower now, they have a surplus. But the debt to GDP has been rising. Why? Because they have not been spending on all these areas that actually do increase productivity. Productivity is a result of investment, private and public. It's not a result of just taking away tax and regulation, which again is something I know is very important for the discussions you're having here. This spending here, sorry, I should have told you, GERD is gross R&D spending, research and development spending over GDP. So the countries that are hurting the most today in Europe are the ones that have spent less on all these variables like research and development that actually increase innovation and productivity in all areas. And in terms of business R&D spending, how much businesses actually spend, you, for example, have some problems here. Your own companies are not spending very much. You're sort of an outlier, close to Luxembourg. I mean, I don't even know what Luxembourg produces, right? So this is not a good thing, Norway being so close to Luxembourg. This shows you have very low R&D spending compared to your GDP. Partly that's because you have such high GDP, right? Your denominator is so high. But it's also true that Norwegian companies do not spend much on R&D. And so the big question for policymakers is, what should we do? How do we increase that? And the sort of message that I've been telling you is you don't just increase that by making it easier for the companies. Again, reducing their costs in whatever way, reducing red tape and regulation and taxes. The way to actually increase it is really to have a vision, a mission for this country to directly invest in the areas that you as a society will decide are important to invest in, which then create the opportunities, which then business follows. The big question, I think, for many countries is, what's going to be the next big thing after the internet? And I think many of us hope it will be something green. And here, too, if you start looking at the patterns worldwide, they're very similar to what I've seen for nanotech, biotech, and the internet, which is that upper right-hand quadrant, high capital intensity, high risk, high uncertainty, is almost completely absent, devoid of private finance. In fact, there's some really interesting databases that I use for my work, for example, the Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and what we see is if you take the whole worldwide private financial sector, all of it, everything in venture capital, everything in private equity, stock market, and corporate money, you add it up, it's something like 8 times less than just the money that 4 public banks are spending around the world. And these are the China Development Bank, the German KfW, the Brazilian BNDES, and the European Investment Bank. And what's interesting, again, is we don't know how to talk about this as economists. So when we look at the numbers, for example, for the German bank, which is called the KfW, we see that not only have they been counter-cyclical, which is, again, what Keynes argues public banks should be, right? And when we had the crisis in 2007, private banks took away the credit, took away the loans, right? They were acting pro-cyclically, and this particular public bank actually increased lending. That's the whole point of the public sector. You're not supposed to act like the private sector, otherwise, you know, it all just gets too cyclical. But also, they directed that money in a particular direction, which was green. In fact, Germany today has a very interesting strategy for the whole economy, which is called the Energiewende policy, which is really thinking about green not only in terms of, you know, wind, solar, biofuels, but really greening all different sectors. And this is, of course, something that's very challenging, especially for a country like your own that is so focused right now on fossil fuels and oil. The China Development Bank, if you look at these numbers, you won't have time to read the whole thing, but it's extraordinary. In all sectors, by the way. Huawei, right? Huawei, the phone, is #1 in the world. They have the #1 market in the world in terms of market share. They received some massive loan from this bank as well, something like 4 billion. That's a lot of zeros. But these are the green companies in China receiving this money, which doesn't mean it all succeeds. Don't forget that most innovation fails, right? I mean, even the internet was just one project. The same organization in the US government that funded the internet, DARPA, failed on all sorts of other things. The Tesla investment, the same amount of money went to Solyndra, that failed. So you really have to also be willing to fail, willing to be explorative. And this also, by the way, is very important for thinking of what kind of people should be, you know, we should be trying to get to work inside government institutions. They should be people who welcome the explorative, trial and error, if you want, innovation process and willing to fail. However, you also have to do this with an engaged private sector, and this comes back to, you know, one of the problems you might have here and how much your own big energy companies are reinvesting their profits in new opportunities. And I put this graph up here before ending. Oh, good, I still have 8 minutes. Because in Silicon Valley and in the whole IT revolution, you know, of course, private companies were present. And this particular, if you want, provocative title I put here is that, you know, Xerox PARC and Bell Labs were 2 private laboratories co-funded by government but housed within businesses. And were extremely important to funding lots of the big revolutions within the information technology revolution. And so one of the questions is, do we have that same level of commitment today within the private sector? And the answer is not really. Just looking at these graphs here, for example, how much energy companies are spending in, say, renewable energy. But what's really important is to remember, where did, for example, Bell Labs come from? Was it just AT&T, which was the company, big monopoly telephone company in the US that just decided one day to set up a big innovation section of the company? No, it was the government that forced them. So AT&T was a monopoly in the US in the 1920s, and well, and still up until recently, and government basically told them, you know what, we could, you know, bash you tomorrow with antitrust policy, competition policy. You're too big. But as long as you reinvest your profits back into the economy, into the big stuff, along with us, into the big new innovations of the future, because you've got a lot of profits, then we'll lay off. And Bell Labs was born out of that negotiation, that healthy tension between government and business. And this is one of the issues today. Not only do we not have what Keynes argued for, a New Deal, which means investment kind of in the Roosevelt sense, but we even just lack a deal. There's a very asymmetric relationship between business and government, where government is constantly asking business, what would you like? What should we take away? Too much tax, too much regulation? As opposed to saying, hey, we're in this together. Let's think big together. Let's think about big missions together, and we'll have a deal. You know, give and take, both sides. And so this is one of the reasons, I think, that today we have increasing inequality in many countries. We talk about the need for government to invest, so to socialize the risks, but because we don't have a proper framework through which to talk about it, in this way that I've been arguing for, market shaping, market making, taking big risks together, we end up socializing the risks, but privatizing the rewards, especially in places like the US and the UK, But from what I understand, you're starting to go into that direction as well with all this talk about privatization, as if, you know, somehow you have a good part of the economy and a sluggish part of the economy, and you just need to move everything towards this wonderfully dynamic part in order to increase competition. This is a very dysfunctional way to think about things. Just quickly, one of the biggest dysfunctions, which I alluded to in the beginning, is, again, the financialization of industry, where Pfizer, Cisco, even Apple recently has spent huge amounts of their money just in buying back their own shares, their stocks, right? So these are the repurchases, when companies repurchase back their own shares in order to boost stock prices, boost stock options, and boost executive pay. The kind of things that, you know, people are worried about who talk about inequality. The black line is the one that should actually really worry you. That's the repurchases over research spending for the Fortune 500 companies, which together have spent, just in the last decade, this is now outdated actually, this number here was for the last decade from 2007, 10 years before. The recent figures are more close to 5 trillion. So huge amounts of money being spent there. And so Piketty, who I know also spoke here recently, of course, has been thinking, what should we do about this rising inequality, right? And he calls for a wealth tax. And the problem is, you know, that a wealth tax on its own maybe won't be enough until we really challenge the underlying sort of corporate governance, but also the myths about what actually, for example, should be done with different types of taxes, not just the wealth tax. So capital gains tax, which is the tax that you spend when you just do a quick trade, right? When you buy and sell a share or even buy and sell a house. That tax in particular, which he talks about, what's interesting is to go back and ask, why did it fall so much? In the US, it fell by 50%, 5-0, one tax, capital gains tax, which is the tax that the financial sector cares about, between 1976 and 1981. Why? Because the venture capital sector, which was telling the world how important they were to funding innovation and making the world competitive, argued that that's what needed to be done in order for them to increase their investments. And this, of course, is this wonderfully famous communist, Warren Buffett. I'm joking, he's one of the most rich investors of the world, saying, you know what? That never affected my investment. You know, I don't look at tax, I look at opportunities. And all that reduction in tax has done is increase inequality. And we should really learn from those mistakes, which have been done in countries like the US, before we repeat them in countries around the world. And so what we really need, again, is not just to think about innovation, productivity, competitiveness, but also, first of all, what has led to that in the past, how should we think about the new missions, but also how to think about these investments literally as investments, right? Government doesn't just spend, it invests. It often fails. So just like with a venture capital capitalist, we should think of it as a revolving fund. So when you invest in things like the internet and you fail along the way in other things, as long as we can make sure that the flow of money keeps going and doesn't just get siphoned off, we can actually talk about things like the green economy and make sure we have enough money in the government coffers if you want to fund it. And so either we do it through tax. Don't forget that a very famous president in the US, Eisenhower, who was not a communist, right? He was a general, military general, Republican. Do you remember what the top marginal tax rate was in the US under Eisenhower? Just yell out a number.
8%.
Yeah, even higher, 90. I mean, in real terms, it was close to 90%. So, you know, and those were the years that NASA was set up, you know, the National Space Agency, which doesn't mean we need to go back to that system. It's just to say this myth that somehow these really high taxes are somehow going to kill off innovation. Well, you know, that particular fact there challenges it. But let's forget tax for now because it's such a controversial issue. Why didn't the US government retain some equity in Tesla, right, in order to cover the losses that they were going to inevitably make from companies like Solyndra? Of course not. Government shouldn't make money. Government should just sit in the background and, you know, fund this wonderful private sector and, you know, take the downside without making anything in the upside. I've been trying to challenge that. We have, for example, income contingent loans for students. Why not for banks? When Google's algorithm was funded by the National Science Foundation, taxpayer money, there could have been something, perhaps, in that contract that said, okay, you know what, if everything goes bad, no problem, we'll pick up the bill. But if And when you make X billion dollars, perhaps something should come back to this agency that actually helped you, produce that algorithm. Anyway, this is not even the conversation at all. This is not in the conversation. So really, what I've been arguing for is we need to change that conversation, change the question, not worry about picking winner, but really talk about directions. What are the big directions that we want economies to go into? How do we evaluate these investments so we don't just accuse government as soon as it fails? How do we really measure social return and social value in a different way from the one that we've been limited to by economists? How do we build the kind of public sector institutions, including things like the BBC in the UK, which is really innovative? How do we build those kind of organizations which are really kind of, visionary and attract the top people who find it an honor to go work in those organizations? There was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, a physicist who won the Nobel Prize directing the US Department of Energy up until recently, who founded ARPA-E, which is today trying to do the big thinking in renewable energy like DARPA did for the internet. And how do we share both the risks and the rewards? And especially, how do we completely rethink this cartoon image, which is serving no one? It's really just increasing inequality and actually hurting the future generation. And that's it. Thank you.